Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yes. Good morning. We're good? Excellent. I'm shutting it. very much.
this thing is broken. You can't pull it out more.
Okay.
It's going to tip over, okay?
Okay, good morning. It works. It's fine. If you could just, first of all, I'm sorry for my delay. Ganze Meise bin ich verjetzt. And thank you everybody for coming. If you could just please put your cell phones on vibrate, we would appreciate it very much. Okay, is it too loud? It's fine. Okay. Okay. Junior, we're good? I want to thank Junior for his invaluable assistance. Let's see. Okay. Record? We press? Okay. We also put it on vibrate. Huh? Yeah. What is it now? The heat? It's a little hot, no? Are you hot? I'm saying we don't need the heater, do we? You could shut the heater. Thank you. Just don't tell me it's too cold after. I also think it's too hot. Okay. One of the extraordinary developments of the last few decades has been the discovery of DNA in the 1950s. It's hard to describe how profound, dramatic, and extraordinary discovery it was to be able to begin to appreciate the mind-staggering, infinite depth of a single cell in a living organism. Whether it's the human, whether it's an animal, whether it's even an insect, a living plant, tree, bush, shrub. And one of the most fascinating components of this discovery has been that if, say, the human body has approximately 40 trillion cells, that's not million and that's not billion, that's trillion. Some say up to 100 trillion cells, but let's put it this way. It's quite a large number. So you can understand how tiny each cell is, and these are the building blocks of the body. But each cell within itself has a double copy of what's called the DNA or the genome, which is the code by which the entire body functions. So each one of these cells has within it contained what we might call, even though it's completely on a different level, a computer program, a code, which is organized and systemized almost like letters, like literally alphabetic letters, which instruct the cell how to be, how to function, but also documents an instruction for a manual for the entire organism that has to function and live according to its particular chemistry and design. What that means is, if you were theoretically be able to unscroll the genome, the DNA within the cell, to be able to read it like a scroll, there is so much information there that, as one scientist once put it, if you would open it up from beginning to end to be able to read it, it would reach the height of the Empire State Building 3 times. And that's all in one cell of the human body. And this repeats itself 40 trillion times. The reason I mentioned to you this today is it's a fascinating, fascinating component of understanding life, but it also is crucial in order to understand Judaism. There's an expression in Chumash, in Parshas Chukas, Zois HaTorah Adam Ki Amos Bayil. And our sages say that the Torah is a mirror of the Adam, of the human organism. Or the human organism is a mirror of Torah. The Zohar famously says that Torah is the blueprint by which God constructed the universe and all of the universes. A contractor, a good contractor, doesn't do a move without looking into the blueprint of the architect. And if it was a good architect, he made sure in his blueprint to cover everything. Are you going to ask me why in your house it didn't happen that way? That you'll take up with your architect, with your contractor, and by the time you're done with that, you will need a therapist as well. Huh? Thank you. So, a good architect puts into the blueprints every nook and cranny, every nuance, every detail, large or small, that has to go into that home. And the contractor, therefore, follows the plan. So the Zohar says a fascinating thought, that when God wanted to create the world, he also, so to speak, needed a blueprint. And what was that blueprint? The blueprint was Torah. Torah is the blueprint for all of creation. Istakel b'oraisa, he looked into Torah, ubara alma, and thus constructed the universe. And in the Medrash Rabbah, in the beginning of Parshas Bereshis, the Medrash defines the Torah as difterois, which is the Hebrew word for blueprints, by which the universe was created. But what's the point? If God can build a world, he can probably do it without a blueprint. If you could put this into one cell, in one bee, or one mosquito, or any insect, or fish, or tree, or human, what did he need the blueprint? And one of the explanations is because what this really means is that there is no phenomenon in nature, in science, in physics, in cosmology, in botany, in astronomy, in geology, in geography, in any system of thought, from psychology to philosophy, from mathematics to biology, that you will not be able to find a perspective for it in the blueprint. Because if it's not in the blueprint, it's not in the home. The fact that it's in the home means it's in the blueprint, and the blueprint is the place where you will see how it fits into the design of the entire home. The blueprint is not just a factual blueprint, it's also a thematic blueprint, where you will see how this particular detail fits into the larger context of the meaning of existence, of the purpose of existence. What this does is it turns Torah not only into a book of laws, which it's that too, or a book of history, which is that too, a book of instructions, which is that too, that governs Jewish life. But far deeper than that, that is a manifestation of a far larger idea of Torah, and that is that it really encompasses all of the universe. So there is nothing ever in the world or in Torah that is detached from each other. If it exists in the universe, it exists in Torah. And if it exists in Torah, it's manifested somewhere, somehow in the universe, in a large scale and a small scale, in the macrocosm or the microcosm, meaning in the large universe or in the small universe. There's an expression of Chazal, Olam Katan, Zeha Adam, and Avos de Reb Nosson. Each human is a small miniature universe, but somewhere it is reflected. Today, I want to give an example of this truth. And let's understand that just as it is within living organisms, the difference, for example, between the DNA of a person and a chimpanzee is very, very small. For the most part, our DNA is identical, but there is a tiny, tiny little fraction where there is a variation. And the same is true between one person on another level, between one person and another person. So when you ignore details, when you say details don't matter, you're ignoring the stuff of life. If details don't matter, there's no universe. There's no diversity. There's nothing that we see and observe can exist without the tiniest details that distinguish it and make it what it is. There are so many forces active to make everything work, in addition to what I said before, that every detail counts. And therefore, in the blueprint, also it's the same way. The details are not just little details, but they're extremely significant. What is more, in each prat, you have the klal. Just as in the DNA, in each genome you have the entire body, the entire organism. It's also true in Torah. In each verse, in each mitzvah, in each law, in each letter actually, in each word, in each concept, you have that concept, but you also have contained principles that are far-reaching, that are collective, that are all-encompassing. An example, at least one tiny, but nothing is tiny, as we said, I want to explore today. When one reads it, one does not pay much attention to it. It's a redundancy that people often employ in writing and especially in speaking. And yet this little redundancy, which would almost seem like an insignificant detail, carries a profound perspective on life, but it's a profound perspective that ultimately affected today the approach to medicine, the approach to psychology, and the approach to interpersonal relationships. It begins with a verse, a pasuk, in the opening, close to the opening of Parshas Tazria, of the portion of Tazria in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. I try to translate in English for those who may not be fluent in a perfect Hebrew. And I'm going to read to you the pasuk. If you know how to open Parshas Tazria on your phone, you'll see it clearly, but I'll explain it clearly, so that's not necessary. As you know, the Torah portion of Tazria discusses the laws known as tsaras. Tsaras was an unusual illness. The closest English translation for it is leprosy, but I say closest because it's not an accurate translation, because there are similarities, but they're not the same idea. They're not the same thing. Tsaras was an unusual illness that was identified by a white patch, generally identified by a white patch appearing on the skin of a person. And from the Jewish Torah perspective, it was symptomatic of a profound emotional and spiritual blemish within this individual. When these symptoms, this symptom of a white patch plus a few secondary symptoms, appear on the skin, on the flesh of this person, man or woman, it determined this person as being temporarily impure, spiritually impure, tameh, and it required the person to separate from the community. Badad yeshev mechutz lamachna meishavai. The person needed time alone. This was a process of intense introspection, healing alone, away from the social life of a community, of a city, until the symptoms have changed. It could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks, whatever the situation was. And the person, to determine this, we're going to discuss in a moment, but this was basically, in one sentence, what Saras was described in Parshas Tazria and Parshas Mitzayir. The Torah describes the procedures to determine the Saras condition. And here I read from Parshas Tazria, Vayikra, Perik Yud Gimel, Pasuk Beis. Vayikra 13, chapter 13, verse 2. I'll read and I'll translate. Adam kiyeh be'er psarei se'esei sapachai sabaheres v'hoya be'er psarei lenegat saraz v'huvel aaron hakoyen el echad mibanav hakoyen. If a person develops in the flesh of his body various symptoms of white patches, this person should be brought to Aaron the priest or one of his sons, the Koyanim, in that generation. And the pasuk continues, verse 13:3. Now listen. V'ra hakoyen es hanega ba'ir habasar. V'seir ba'nega hafach lavan. Umare hanega amek mer psarei. Nega tzarasu v'ra'o hakoyen v'timei oisai. I translate. V'ra hakoyen es hanega ba'ir habasar. The kohen shall look at the affliction in the skin of this person's flesh. The kohen has to see. And he sees, V'seir ba'nega hafach lavan, the hair in the white patch on the skin also turned white. And the affliction's appearance is deeper than the skin of his flesh because of its whiteness, so it appears deeper. It is a tsaras affliction, nega tsaras. And the pasuk concludes, V'ra'o hakoyen, and the kohen shall look at him, v'timei oisai, and make him impure. The Torah is stating that only a kohen, meaning a descendant of Aaron the high priest, was authorized to diagnose a tsaras, leprosy, and pronounce the malady as such, as a tsaras that makes the person impure. In fact, it's interesting, even in a case where all the symptoms were present, but there's no kohen around, the person doesn't become impure. One must have a kohen to be able to determine that this person is impure. No one else can diagnose the person as such. There always has to happen through a kohen. This itself needs a shir. Why would that be? I mean, if the symptoms are obvious, the symptoms are obvious. Does it change because of a kohen? That's a good question, but it's not for this. It's not for this class. But if you listen to this verse, you noticed a blatant redundancy. And the redundancy was, and I'm going to focus on those words, it starts off, V'ra hakoyen es hanega ba'ir habasar. The kohen sees the affliction in the skin of the person's flesh. And he looks at the symptoms. The hair became white. The appearance of the affliction is deeper than the skin. The Torah says it's a nega tsaras. V'ra'o hakoyen, the kohen shall see him, v'timei oisai, and make him impure. 1 second. You started off that the kohen shall see him. Why do you repeat it again? It's very, very, it doesn't belong in the pasuk. It's a redundancy that is completely out of place. Why say again the kohen shall look at it? I'll say it in English so you'll notice it perhaps clearer. You'll say the kohen, I'm going to eliminate all the details just to get to the point. The kohen should look at the skin of this person's body, and if this and this shows up, it's a tsaras, and he should declare him impure. You don't have to say again, and the kohen sees him and makes him impure. That was the beginning of the pasuk. V'ra kohen es hanega ba'ir habasar, etc. Nega tsaras hu v'timei oisai, say he's tamei. Torah doesn't say that. V'ra kohen es hanega ba'ir habasar. Nega tsarasu v'ra'o hakoyen v'timei oisai. He looks again. He's looking at the person. He's a responsible kohen. He's looking and he's examining, and all the symptoms are there. So now finish. You would say somebody came to the doctor. The doctor examined him or her thoroughly. And the doctor looked here and looked there and saw this and saw that and saw that. And the doctor basically says, these are symptoms of the following illness, and this is the prescription. You're not going to say at this point, the doctor says these are the symptoms of the illness, and the doctor saw him and gave him the prescription. Obviously, that's what we're talking about. The doctor didn't see him, he can't say all this. And yet, this is what the Torah does here. The kohen shall look at the affliction of the skin of his flesh, and then again at the end, the kohen shall see it. Why is the same phrase repeated? It doesn't have to say again, the kohen should look at it. You read this, you look at it, and you say, okay, so it says it twice. So it's the Ekwelt, it's the end of the world, so it says twice, the kohen looked at him. I mean, what's the Groise Gedula? But if you're dealing with the DNA of existence, a redundancy is very, very serious. It's not so simple. Such details, such inaccuracies, such excessiveness or superfluous words are extremely profound. So we're going to explore the perspective of one great thinker, one great rabbi, who offered a magnificent explanation. As it turns out, the origins of what we call today holistic medicine or holistic healing or the integrated approach as it's known today come from this redundancy in Torah. One of the prominent sages and leaders of Eastern Europe before the Second World War was a man known as Reb Meir Simcha HaKoyen of Dvinsk. Reb Meir Simcha HaKoyen was born in 1843. He passed away in 1926. He was one of the prominent Jewish sages and leaders in the beginning of the 20th century. He himself was a kohen, and thus the commentary, I guess, was quite personal. He served as the rabbi of a town, a city in Latvia, known as Dvinsk. He was the rabbi of the Ashkenazic community in Dvinsk, while his contemporary, the Rogatchover Gaon, Rabbeinu Yosef Rosen, was the rabbi of the Hasidic community in Dvinsk. And he served in that position as the Rav of Dvinsk for 39 years, till his passing in 1926. He authored a very famous work on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, known as Or Sameach. Or Sameach means a joyous light. And today there's the yeshivas known as Or Sameach, but it originates in the commentary of Rabbeinu Meir Simcha HaKoyen on the Rambam. He also wrote a classic commentary on Chumash known as Meshech Chachma. That's the commentary of Meir Simcha HaKoyen of Dvinsk. Now, he was a well-known address. People used to come to him. Besides being a rabbi and a sage, he was also a leader. People came to him for advice from all over Poland and Lithuania. He died in 1926 in a hotel in Riga, where he went to seek medical treatment. And sadly, he only had one daughter who predeceased him. So when he passed away, he had no children. His daughter got married, but both she and her husband died young without children. And I mention this because he had no children, no descendants, but his life lives on through both of his works and many institutions that carry his name. Or Sameach, he named so because it was a derivative of his name, Meir Simcha. Meir means to illuminate, and Simcha means joy. Or Sameach is joyous light. His second work, Meshech Chachma, you see that? Meshech is Meir Simcha Koyen. Meshech Chachma. So, Next time you hear the Meshech Chachma commentary on Chumash, you'll know the background. The Meshech Chachma suggests that the Torah is teaching a very profound law and very profound lesson. And I'm sorry for reading the verse again, but I want you to really understand this. So I want to show you how he develops this. Again, the Chumash says, the Kohen shall look at the affliction on the skin of his flesh. If he sees the following symptoms, it is a tzaras affliction. The Kohen shall look at him and make him impure. Says the Meshech Chachma, it's not a redundancy. It's two completely separate things. In the first part of the verse, the Torah is talking about the Kohen looking at what? Looking at the symptoms. The end of the verse, the Kohen is not looking at the symptoms. The Kohen is looking at what? At the person. So the first time it says, V'ra hakohen es hanega b'oram basar. He has to examine the affliction. Show me. Where is it? It could be in different places of the body, and the Kohen Pashat has to look and study it, and study its size, and study its dimensions, and study the spot, and study where it is, and study the secondary symptoms. And when it happened, there's a lot of details and nuances to know, like a good physician who studies the symptoms very, very well, and may have to examine it and scrutinize it for a while. Then we're expecting the Torah to say, Nega tzarasu, he sees these are the symptoms, it's a leprosy. He says, no. Now the Torah says, V'ra'ohu hakohen. The Kohen should look at him and make him impure. He's not looking now at the leprosy. He's not looking at the symptoms. V'ra'ohu, he's looking at the human being, whether it's a man, he, or it's a she, it's a woman. And then and then he could make him impure. In other words, what the Torah is suggesting here in a very subtle way is that there are two completely separate evaluations. One evaluation is on the disease. The other evaluation is not on the disease, it's on the person. First, the Kohen has to look at the affliction, and see if it technically meets the definition of tzaras described in the Torah. So he has to examine all the symptoms and give a proper diagnosis based on his knowledge of Torah. But that's not enough. Now there has to be knowledge, not of Torah. There has to be knowledge of the person. Now there's a second evaluation. He has to look at the person. V'ra'ohu hakohen. He, who's he? The totality of the person. And the Kohen has to look at him and then define and determine if it's appropriate to make this person pure or impure. So even after the Kohen has scrutinized all of the symptoms and he determined that the man or woman possesses the symptoms, he can't declare the person impure. Torah says, wait, there's still a second evaluation that you didn't make. V'ra'ohu hakohen. You have to evaluate not the affliction now. Now you have to evaluate the person. You have to determine whether it's appropriate for this person at this stage to be declared impure. If so, this redundancy, not only is it not a redundancy, it's a completely new idea. Because the Kohen has to evaluate two factors, whether the blemish is a tzaras, and B, whether it's the appropriate person and time to make this human being a mitzvah. What would this mean practically? Let's understand this practically. There's another pasuk later that says, "Ubiyoim heiraz boy." In the day that the leprosy will show up, he should declare him impure. So the Talmud, the Gemara in Tractate Mayat Katan, page 7, learns from this, there is a day when the Kohen could look at it, and there's a day that the Kohen can't look at it. Ubiyoim heiraz boy. The day that it will appear to the Kohen. What do you mean the day? Any day. No, there are days yes, and there are days not. And from here the Talmud learns what happens if it's the middle of Yom Tov, it's the middle of Pesach, it's the middle of Shavuos, it's the middle of Sukkot, and somebody has these symptoms, and they come to the Kohen and they say, what's the status? The Kohen doesn't have to look. The Kohen could look, not look, but the Kohen is now exonerated from his responsibilities, says, come back to me after Yom Tov. The same is true a chassan or a kala. In the middle of Sheva Brachas, in the expression of Chazal, chassan shanoiled by nega, noisten loy kol shiva simei hamishta. He has all the symptoms. And if a kohen is there to Sheva Brachas, and it's the middle of the day, he should say, oh, you're tameh. No, we don't do that. He gives him till the end of Sheva Brachas, whether it's him or her, and afterwards he will go and examine and determine the status of the person. That's what our sages teach. How can the rabbis come up with such a novel law? I mean, it seems strange. If the Torah says that somebody is a leper and needs a certain treatment, delaying it is wrong. Imagine if a doctor notices something on a groom or a bride in the middle of the Sheva Brachas. Doctor will say, oh, I'm not going to deal with it till after the Sheva Brachas. What if it's a serious situation? Helping the person by delaying noticing or examining what's going on is a cruel thing to do. The same is true in the middle of Yom Tov, just because it's the middle of Pesach or Shavuos or Sukkot. You're going to delay medical treatment for a patient in the middle of the holidays, not to aggravate him or her. You're not doing them a favor. You're doing the wrong thing. So how can the rabbis come up with this novel law to delay the entire process of examination and diagnosis till after Pesach? It's 8 days. Sukkot, 9 days. Shavuos, 1 day. And Eretz Yisrael, or wherever it is. It could be 2 days. Shiva Simei Mishta, Sheva Brachas, a whole week. How can, if the Torah says this is it and this is the treatment the person needs, you're not doing them a favor. But the Meshech Chochmah argues brilliantly that this is part of what the Torah is telling us here. Part of what the Torah is telling us here is that saras, not being a regular illness, but being a spiritual illness that's identified or expressed in these symptoms, the Torah says, I don't only want you to evaluate the disease. I want you to evaluate the person as well. And therefore, I don't want you to only look at the malady, also look at the human being. So the person may have a disease, but the person is not ready to become impure. Don't deem him impure. And to destroy the joy of this marriage by declaring the chassan or the kala impure or the joy of the holiday, the Torah is saying is inappropriate. And in this case, the chassan and kala are really not impure. It's delayed. But that we learn from the words ubiyoim heiraz boy, that there's a day when you look, and there's a day that the Torah says don't look. Here, V'ra'o HaKohen teaches something even deeper. It's not only about time, it's also about the person. There are times that are inappropriate. In the middle of Yom Tov, don't take a father or a mother or a son or a daughter away from the family and say, you got to go outside of the camp because you're a mitzvah. Don't take a chassan away during Sheva Brachas. You have to evaluate the right time in context of the person. V'ra'o HaKohen teaches me even more. You have to look at the person and know exactly where this person is before you give such a verdict of Tumah. Now, this approach, articulated millennia ago in Torah, in this one redundancy of Ra'o HaKohen, is now reflected in our approach to medicine as well. Because when you think about it, there are two approaches to medicine. And the decision as which model to use revolves around the following question, and it's a deep question. What's the goal of the physician? Does the physician treat is the goal of the physician to eliminate the symptoms of a person's illness, or does the physician treat with the goal of putting the entire patient in balance? What's the real goal of the doctor? Treating the person or treating the disease? If the goal is treating the disease. So the first thing is you confront the disease. The goal is stopping the pain, stopping the discomfort, eliminating the symptoms, eliminating the cause behind the symptoms. So the physician has to consider the fastest, least complicated, least expensive therapy and the approach with the fewest side effects. That's one component. Should the goal be to promote overall balance and well-being, now the physician has to choose a treatment and a protocol which best addresses the patient's patterns and constitution and history. In other words, he has to appreciate the totality of the person. The physician has to understand the history of this patient, including all of the imbalances in this patient's biochemistry, biomechanics, bioelectricity, as well as non-physical considerations, his emotional, mental, psychological, and spiritual state. What's the goal of the physician? What do most doctors do? So the Torah is telling us here that the healer's approach shouldn't only be to focus and get rid of the particular symptoms, but to look at the entire person, the whole person. Why? Because if you don't, you may tackle these symptoms, which is good, but the whole person might not get well. You're not identifying patterns that exist within this life that are interconnected to the entire organism of the human being. And this symptom is one detail. You're tuning into a detail without taking into account that there's a full holistic approach. There's a whole human being, and this is part of it. So what happens? What happens is, and this is the great debate between in the world of medicine, what happens, many argue, is when you just identify the symptoms and that's it, either there will be some other new conditions, or the conditions originally treated might return. Not always, but in some cases. So therefore, it's of course important to deal always with the symptoms and the issue at hand, the details. But we try to treat the whole person and not just to suppress local symptoms, which really is a bigger question of how you deal even with these symptoms. Is the focus to suppress the symptoms, or is the focus to get to the core issues in the depth of the human condition from which these symptoms originally arose? If you want to get to that place, you have to know the whole person. If you're not interested in that, you have a headache, take Tylenol. Put on a Band-Aid, or whatever the Band-Aid means in this particular field of medicine. So very often, that's what the healer knows. He doesn't know more, or she doesn't know more. They were trained, this is what you see, this is what you do, and it works. But if I'm suppressing it, then I didn't deal with the core issue. So maybe it's going to return, maybe it's going to come up in other ways. You probably know Dr. Sarna recently passed away, and he revolutionized the whole way that people look at back pain. And he said it has to do with your back like it has to do with turtles in New Zealand. Your back, saying it has nothing to do with your back. It has to do with suppressed anxiety. Could be by your own relationships in your marriage or your children or yourself or your psyche or the world or your, completely not to do with your back. It's the way the body is responding to your own unresolved and unacknowledged and suppressed deep pain and anxiety. So if my focus is simply to get rid of my back pain, it's about the back and it's about the pain. And you might go to massages, you might go to a chiropractor. Some people go through surgery. And his point was, doesn't work that way. This is part of a whole person. Let's figure out the totality of the person to the best of our ability, and that's how we should treat it. V'ra'ohu hakohen. But the truth is that this is not only relevant to healers and medicine and bodily illnesses, Rahman al-Islam, but also to all of us, because before you can pronounce a person as tameh, as impure, you have to always look at the human being and give a very comprehensive evaluation and determine whether at this juncture in time and this particular person in this situation can be deemed impure. Not always is it fit for somebody who has the symptoms of impurity to be deemed impure. It's sometimes the wrong thing. A rabbi once shared with me something profound. He said, when people ask you questions, don't always answer the question. Make sure, first and foremost, to answer the person. And it sounds simple, but it's not so simple. A person comes to me and says, why did this and this happen to me in my life? I can answer the question. I could try to answer the question. Maybe not, maybe yes. But even if I answer the question, even if I do, even if I know, which usually I don't, but even if I would theoretically know, and I can answer the question, I answer the question, but I didn't answer the person. I was sitting some time ago at a kumsitz in Pomona with a group of, 40 or 50 teenagers from a particular yeshiva. And they were sitting with guitars around a fire. There was a fire pit and a beautiful fire, and they were roasting marshmallows and hot dogs and other healthy foods and enjoying a very nice evening. And between songs, I was sharing some ideas, some stories. And one of the boys sat down near me. And he was singing. He had a beautiful voice. He was singing near me. And as we were singing, so I put my hand on his shoulder, and we were singing together. In the middle of one of the songs, he turns to me, and he says, so why did my mother die when I was 9 years old? He was at that point, I think, 20 or 21. So this occurred 11 years earlier. It happened a few months ago. And he said, why did his mother had cancer. She had 11 children. She died a young lady, I think 39 or so, or 40. And his father was left to raise all these kids. And he was a young boy. And he was very close to his mother. And he tells me, why did my mother die so young? So I looked at him, and I said, I don't know. I don't know why your mother died so young. I'm so sorry for the profound pain you must be living with and you have endured for so many years. I don't know the answer. And this is what he told me. He started to cry right there, and he said, you know, you're the first person who told this to me. I said, what do you mean? He said, for years, he went to people to ask this question. He was obsessed with getting an answer to this question. And he said, everybody gave him a reason. Everybody. He went from one person to another person to another person. He went to a lot of rabbis. He went to a lot of people. And I said to him, what did their answers do? He says, they just got me furious and angry. I said to him, well, I really don't know. It's not like it's not a genius answer. I really don't know. He said, that's the answer I was waiting for. Because I wanted people to stop justifying and rationalizing my pain. They should just give validity to the depth of my pain. And he just sat there sobbing for a while, and I had my hand on his shoulder. And it was a very profound moment for me, because I'm not here judging anybody, but the point is this. I'm not sure most people have an answer to that question. But say somebody even thinks he or she has an answer, which they don't. They're not prophets. Who knows why his mother died? Who knows? They're not prophets. But let's say somebody thinks he's a prophet. Or let's say somebody heard a voice. There's answering the question and answering the person. Even if you can give this person an answer. What is this, a mathematical equation he's looking to resolve? This is a pain. This is a pit in his chest. Since that day, he lost his mother. And he went through a lot since then. He went through a tremendous amount. So I can always answer the question, or not. In this case, I don't even think you can answer the question. But let's say you answer the question. You have to answer the person, not the question. Meaning, you have to understand what the person is looking for. Are they asking an intellectual question? Or they're asking an emotional question? My students once asked me, when they visit people, they visit Holocaust survivors. And the Holocaust survivors always like to ask, so why did it happen? Not always, but some. What should we answer? I said, I don't know what you should answer. Just one thing, let me tell you. Don't tell them why it happened. First of all, you don't know. And second, it's not the question. Somebody says, why did this happen? They're not looking for an intellectual mathematical equation. They're asking a question that's coming from the depth and the core of their being. Their whole being is crying out in pain. Why? The closest thing you could give them to an answer is an embrace. Because what an embrace is, saying to them, I'm here for you. I find it sometimes mind-staggering that when people go through difficult situations, certain individuals, especially people who feel that their job is to defend God in this world, I don't know why, they always need to rationalize, to justify. They're almost like hired by God as his lawyer to come to these people and say, we're going to make sense out of it. And usually what it does is it completely devalues, completely disengages, completely lose the trust and the heart of the people. For starters, it shows them that they completely don't understand what the people are going through. You don't have to have answers. You could look into somebody's eyes and say, I'm so sorry. I just want you to know that I want to be here for you in the best way I can. Maybe at some point the person is ready for a different conversation, and even then you have to know what that conversation has to look like. And this is true in so many other areas in life. We sometimes answer the question, but we lose the opportunity to answer the person. Your child sometimes asks you a question. Don't only answer the question. Seize the moment and answer the person. Don't only look at the symptoms, but also look at the person. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, have a done as kala adam lekafschos. Judge every person meritoriously. So the Sfas Emes says there's a deeper component in the words of the contained in the words of the Mishnah. Have a done as kala adam lekafschos doesn't only mean judge every person meritoriously. It means have a done as kol ha'adam. When you're talking to a person, you have to be able to see kol ha'adam, the totality of the person. You can't just pluck out one component of their life and examine it and scrutinize it. Until you don't understand kol ha'adam, the entire human being, it's impossible to judge a person. I know nothing about the person, just like in healing. Just like in healing. A doctor, a real doctor, is not somebody who knows a krenk, as they used to say. He identifies an illness. That's good. It's good stuff. But a real doctor is somebody who is ready to know the person. Have a done as kol ha'adam. And today, this has become increasingly more and more popular because it's a more genuine, it's a more holistic approach that also has to do with preventive medicine. Because if I can appreciate the biochemistry, the bioelectricity of the person, and all of the components of the person, then the healing is a much more profound healing, including preventive medicine. So therefore, when I judge a person, have a done as kala adam, you need the entire human being. Don't look at the leprosy, look at the person. Sometimes we have children or students who are behaving disrespectfully or behaving in what we feel is, or truly, in a very inappropriate way, whether in words or in actions. Maybe your child is saying hurtful things to you, and really disrespectful and hurtful things to you. Maybe obnoxious things to you. Or not even obnoxious or disrespectful, but things that hurt you. Things that are very, very difficult for you to hear. And naturally, at such a moment, some of us are tempted. Our knee-jerk reaction is to say, you're tameh. You're blemished. You're sick. You're impure. And some of us go a step further and say, Mechutz lamachana meishavai. You can't have a place here. You don't belong here. You belong outside of this home, outside of this school, outside of this community. This happens very often. And when you'll ask the person, the parent, the teacher, the principal, the educator, why? And they'll say, did you see? Did you see? And the symptoms are there. The illness is there. It's not like people are making it up or they're just bad people. They're technically, on paper, they may actually be right. This boy or this girl has all the symptoms. These behaviors are obnoxious, unacceptable, immoral, disrespectful, ill-conceived. But the Torah says, wait. Before you ever tell a person you're impure, it's not enough to look at the symptoms. You always have to look at the whole person. You have to look at the person. You have to understand the person. If you don't understand the person, you don't have a right, al pi Torah, to call the person impure. Because that second essential evaluation is missing. And what that means is, I can't only look at your behavior right now or yesterday or even last year. I have to reflect on the totality of this person's story. Don't just try to, and it's also true, even if you could suppress the symptoms. Even if I could suppress the symptoms and make them disappear, I give him a Tylenol. But I didn't address the person. And if you don't address the person, you know what's going to happen. The symptoms are going to come back 3 years later when they're not under your control anymore. So sometimes we become so overwhelmed by the symptoms. Let's just suppress them. Let's get rid of them. Let it look good. It can look good. Well, sometimes say, let's marry him off. Let's marry her off. Sometimes that's a good thing. But sometimes you're just suppressing horrible, horrible symptoms. And when you're suppressing horrible, horrible symptoms, they're going to come back in 6 months. But this time it's going to be much worse. Because you already involved other people. They already are entangled with other people. They're already in different relationships. They're a whole different, and what if there's children? So we sometimes make these decisions based on a symptom, completely not based on a human being. And this is what I have to ask myself. Calling this person impure, contaminated, tarnished, blemished, is it really going to help them? Is this what the person needs? Will this serve his or her interest? Will it help the person rehabilitate himself? Is it possible maybe there is a deep pain in this child's heart that he is incapable of addressing, causing him tremendous anguish and anger? Is there some void in some relationship here in this home or in this family or in this marriage or in these children that they're incapable of articulating? And therefore, it's expressing itself in these ways. Is it possible that this child needs a father? He may not have a relationship with a father. Is it possible that this child needs a mother? This boy or girl needs a mother or a father. So this child needs more of his father, not less of his father. By his father telling him or his mother telling him you're impure, they're giving him less of a father and mother, and what he really needs is more of a father and a mother. He needs more closeness, not more distance. You're trying to help this child. How are you helping them? By causing the symptoms to become stronger because you're not addressing the core of the symptoms. What is at the core of the person rather than the symptoms themselves? There was the famous tzaddik of Yerushalayim. You've heard of him, Reb Aryeh Levin. You heard of Reb Aryeh Levin. He was an extraordinary figure. He passed away in 1969. He was known as the tzaddik of Jerusalem, and he would visit all the prisoners under the British mandate. In the 40s, he was known, and for years, till his death in the 50s and 60s, he would go to prisons and visit Jewish prisoners. He was a very warm Jew. And Rabbi Aryeh Levin was once walking on the street in Jerusalem, and he had a former student who completely abandoned the Jewish way of life. Rabbi Aryeh Levin was a tall man in spirit, but a very short man in height. So you could see him walking in the streets of Yerushalayim, and he would walk fast, and he had a student who completely left Yiddishkeit. So he saw his old Rebbe coming against him, and he felt awkward. He liked him, but he felt awkward, because the way he looked. So he decided to cross the street. You ever do that when there was still enough space, so you don't have to get into a conversation. Reb Aryeh saw that, so he went after him, and he caught up to him, and he says, "Shalom Aleichem, I'm so happy to see you, but I saw that you avoided me. Please be honest with me. You can be honest with me. Why would you want to avoid me?" So he says, "I'll be perfectly honest. I'm very embarrassed to see you because I don't have a yarmulke on my head. And I didn't want to bump into you without a yarmulke, so that's why I did it. Anyway, here I am anyway without a yarmulke because you bumped into me. But I was trying to avoid the awkwardness." And he looked at him and he said, "My dear student, don't you realize I am a very short man? I can only see up to your heart. That's all I can see." And that student shared that. It not only left an impact on him, it transformed him. Rabbi Aryeh Levin was a very, very big Yirei Shamayim. He was known as the tzaddik of Yerushalayim. He cared about a yarmulke. But he wanted to see the person, and he let the person know that he's seeing him. He said, "I'm a short man. I only see up to people's hearts. I don't see anymore. Sorry. For this, I have to be able to peer deeply into a person, appreciate the individual, appreciate their experiences, their backgrounds, where they are today, where they're coming from, what they have been through, what their fears are, what their struggles are. They may be making wrong decisions. These symptoms of leprosy are not good symptoms. The Torah is not saying they're good, but the Torah is saying before you deem this person impure, you have to understand who the person is and make sure this is what's going to rehabilitate and heal the person from this state. They tell a story about one of the great Hasidic masters that he was seeing people. And when people would come in, come out, so after each few people, he called in his assistant, and he took off his frock, his kapota, and it was soaking wet. And he asked him to bring him a change of clothes. And finally, at some point, this man says, "Was schwitzt ihr also? Why are you sweating so much? Well, what have you been doing? You're not working out. You're sitting in your office meeting people." And he responded to him, and he said something very powerful. He said, "In the past few hours, dozens of people came to see me. Each of them poured out his soul and asked for my assistance. In order for me to be able to understand what these people were saying, I had to take off my clothes and put on their clothes. Because if I would be sitting in my clothes, I couldn't even understand what they're talking about. So I had to put on their clothes in order to listen to them. When they finish speaking, I now have to respond. But if I'm wearing their clothes, I can't respond because they're the ones who came with the problem, and I also have that problem. So I have to take off their clothes and put on my clothes and respond from my perspective to be able to guide them. But then they have another question. So I have to, again, take off my clothes and put on their clothes. And then when I want to answer, I have to be able to see it from a larger perspective, so I have to put on my clothes. And so in the last hour, I have changed my clothes hundreds of times. If you would be changing your clothes on and off hundreds of times, they would also be sweating. And if this is true with spiritual clothes, do you know how much more difficult it is with psychological clothes, emotional clothes, spiritual clothes? That's why I'm sweating. So I can hear the problem, or I can always listen to the person. So this is true in almost every field of life. perhaps most dramatically, it's true, I should say, it's true also quite significantly in the realm of emotional healing, spiritual healing, or what we would call today psychology. Sometimes a person is suffering from a problem. There are people who follow textbooks. You come in, here is the issue. There's already a textbook. This is the issue. This is symptoms of this particular problem. This is what you say. So here is, I don't know if it may sound audacious what I'm saying, but I think it's more or less true. There are two types of therapists in the world. Two types of psychologists in the world. Two types of counselors in the world. Two types of coaches in the world. All types of emotional healers and doctors. There are those who are educated well. But what are they educated in? Textbook information. So you come to me, or whoever this person is, I don't mean me, but whoever this healer is, with a problem. So I open my textbook, either physically or mentally. Say, oh, this must be this. Okay, so we know what to do, right? And he or she follows protocol. The problem is, every person's problem is nuanced. So it never exactly fits the description in Wikipedia or in the psychological textbook. So what does the healer do? He cuts corners and makes sure that you fit in to this model, and therefore this is the treatment. If it's a psychiatrist, sometimes this kid needs medication. If it's a psychological issue, this is the way we deal with it. In other words, he defined the person's problem and fitted it into a pre-existing model that he or she is familiar with. That's not real healer. A real healer never does that. It's not like, I have a model. This is what I do. If you come, I'm going to somehow fit you into this model, and you're going to go out with this and this treatment. Sometimes it can help for a certain aspect for a little bit. The real way of healing is, I have no model. I'm not going to put you into any particular model. On the contrary, I'm going to use all my models and all my information and all my wisdom to adjust and tune in to your particular reality and situation and see what is the opportunity in this particular reality. That's much, much more nuanced. It's much more profound, but it's authentic. It's much more real. And this requires knowledge in a broad sense. If I only know one particular field, so that's what I'm good at. That's the difference between a person who has a broadness, and sometimes they could borrow from this discipline and borrow from this discipline. Like a good chef, yeah? You don't have to follow the recipe book. You know what I mean? Because you have a mastery. You appreciate, you're not just a robot. You're not just a robot, you appreciate the essence. So you could take from here, you could take from there. And that's how you heal. In each of our lives, it's also true. When somebody comes with an issue, I can give a knee-jerk response that comes from a reaction. Okay, this is it, this is what you do, this is, and then right away you compare it to yourself. Oh, it happened to me, exactly the same thing. This is what I did, I got butter from it. Torah says no. We have to have the courage and the patience and the perseverance to be able to look at the person, not only at the symptoms. And this is one of the reasons we come back now to why the kohen is the only one eligible to do this. If it's a technical symptom, so anybody who's learned should be able to do it. It's like saying somebody went to medical school and they know all the symptoms of these particular illnesses, but you need a kohen to say, what's going to help a kohen? You need somebody who's knowledgeable. And one of the explanations is because kohenim were given the mitzvah to bless the Jewish people every single day. In the blessing before Berachas Kohanim, they say, Asher Kedeshanu B'Kedushasei Shel Aaron, V'tzivanu Levarech Es Ama Yisrael B'Ahava. We were commanded to bless the Jews with love. Why don't we say that with every mitzvah? Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos Kodesh B'Ahava. Hafrashas Chala B'Ahava. Likvaya Mezuzah B'Ahava. L'nicht. Every mitzvah should be B'Ahava. It should be. Here, there's a special emphasis on love. And the reason is because the halacha says a kohen who doesn't love the community is not allowed to do berachas kohenim. If a kohen has a a grudge or has, say, some beef with somebody, it's not spashut. He's not supposed to get up to bless. A kohen has to be in love, has to be loving to the community, to all. But there's a deeper explanation. V'tzivanu, he commanded us levarich es Am Yisrael be'ahava, to bless the Jewish people with love. The greatest blessing we can give the Jewish people is they should have ahava. The Zohar says that the souls of the kohanim come from the world of chesed. And therefore, the Torah says as follows. When somebody has a leprosy, they may have all the symptoms. But if a man of love is not the one who was in charge on the ultimate diagnosis, it's an unacceptable diagnosis. The only way we can trust the diagnosis according to Torah is if it's a person whose soul personifies love. Because that person, we understand, is not just going to say Tameh, but that person will wait. Have they done as Kol Adam? And when you see Kol Adam, the totality of the person, then usually a lot of other stuff emerge, which doesn't make the leprosy geschmack or delightful or beautiful, but it puts it into a context that you could treat in a much more authentic and powerful way. So therefore, if there's no kohen, the Torah says the diagnosis is not a diagnosis. So if somebody who's not a kohen, meaning somebody who's not a person of love, comes and says, you're tameh, that's not true. They're not tameh. So this person who said that they're tameh is a moitzi shemra. Moitzi shemra means mitzayra is moitzi shemra. So who's the mitzayra? Not the one who they said is tameh. The one who said that they're tameh. You're the moitzi shemra. It's exactly the other way around. The one who's screaming about this person, he or she is tameh, he is the one who is tameh. Why? Because the symptoms may be right. But if there's no profound ahava, then you're not in touch with the person. You don't even care about the person. And if you don't care about the person, kaput, it's not going to work. I heard from the Tolner Rebbe, Shlita, Rav Weinberg. He had a Zayde, the old Tolner Rebbe. He lived in Bayit Vegan, Yerushalayim. And it was 11 o'clock at night, and a boy came into him from yeshiva. And the boy says he needs a place to sleep. The old Tolner Rebbe was known, people would come to his house from everywhere. He needs a place to sleep. So he says, what happened? He says the mashgiach of the yeshiva caught him doing something wrong, and he threw him out, and he said, you can't even sleep tonight at the yeshiva. You have to leave, go home. So I don't have a place to sleep because he doesn't let me be in the dormitory. So the old Tolner Rebbe was an Alta Yid in his 80s. He says, come, let me against the mashgiach. We're going to visit the mashgiach. So they go to the mashgiach's house, the supervisor of the yeshiva, and he knocks on the door. It's already 11:30 at night. It's close to midnight. And the man comes out in pajamas. And the Tolner Rebbe doesn't want the bacha to be there because either he's put him outside, he kept him in his house. I don't know exactly. And what happened was he turns to Mashiach and he says, I have a question. You threw out this and this boy from the yeshiva? He says, yeah. He says, Rebbe, you know what happened? I'll tell you what. And he tells him a story. Wasn't a nice thing. He says, Versteh, I understand. He says, and where did you expect him to sleep tonight? He says, it's not my problem. He's out of yeshiva. He says, 1 second. When does the last bus leave Bayit Vegan to be able to go to other neighborhoods? Do you know? He says, 8:30. So he says, you throw him out later. Where's he supposed to sleep tonight? Boy needs a bed. He says, it's not my asik. It was too dangerous to keep him in the dormitory because of his spiritual situation. So he says, Echer, and you went into pajamas tonight. He says, yeah. And you're about to go to sleep. He says, yeah. So he says, so explain this to me. You threw a boy out of his bed tonight, and you could still put on pajamas and go to sleep. How does that work? You don't want him in the dormitory? Get out and walk around with him the whole night. Go walk around, Bayit Vegan. Take him on a walk through the park. Stay up with him. He doesn't belong in the dormitory. You get into pajamas? I don't understand you. I don't understand you. The Mashgiach, to his credit, said, you're right. I have to do tshuva. And he apologized. The Tolner Rebbe said when his Zayda died, this man came to the Mashgiach, came to the Shiva, and to his credit, he told over the whole story about himself. He told the story about himself. I was at a wedding some time ago, and I met a Jew named Reb Shlomo Kanevsky. Shlomo Kanevsky is a son of Reb Chaim Kanevsky, and he has a yeshiva in Bnei Brak called Tiferes Tzia. And I heard from him the following story at this wedding, at a chuppah, that the Chazon Ish, Reb Avram Yeshayahu Karelitz, who passed away in 1953 in Eretz Yisrael in Bnei Brak, known as the Chazon Ish, again, Ish is Avram Yeshaya. Also didn't have children. He opened a yeshiva called Tiferes Tzia in Bnei Brak. And he had a Rosh Yeshiva, a teacher who was teaching, the head of the yeshiva. And there was a boy who smoked there on Shabbos in the yeshiva. So after Shabbos on Sunday, the Rosh Yeshiva heard about it and he called him in and he threw him out. So the Chazon Ish called in the Rosh Yeshiva and he said to the Rosh Yeshiva, I heard that you threw out this boy. He said, yeah, he was desecrating Shabbos publicly, there's no choice. So the Chazon Ish said, where is he going to go from yeshiva? He says, I don't know, but to leave him in yeshiva is a horrible thing because who knows what can happen. So he said, you know, from this yeshiva, he's not going to the kollel across the street. Which means, essentially, by throwing him out of yeshiva in the 1930s, when Judaism was very weak, you may be sentencing him to be cut off from Judaism. That's a form of capital punishment. The halach is, the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin that capital punishment has to be decided by a judge, by a court of 23 members. Did you convene 23 members, dayanim, to paskin? So he said, 23 people. I'm the Rosh Yeshiva. He said, I respect you, but you're killing a child. Not physically, but spiritually, it's maybe even worse. You need 23 people. So he tells the Chazon Ish, what do you want me to do? He says, bring 23 judges. Let's have a meeting, and let's decide. If that's the right thing, I'm fine. But you can't just do this on your own. The greatest rabbi and sage in the world is not allowed to say this person goes to death. It doesn't work that way in Judaism. You need 23, and there's a vote. It's a serious thing. Maybe you're right. I'm not saying not. But we need to. He says, I can't run a yeshiva this way. Every boy, I have to get 23 people. He said, then take him back. You can't kill. Take him back. He says, I can't do this. It's the boy or me. If you take back the boy, I quit. You want me to stay? The boy has to leave. I can't be robbed from this authority. He said, I'm not robbing you from authority. I'm robbing you from the authority to kill alone. You can't be a lone killer. So he says, okay, I quit. So he says, listen, the same Mishnah says that for monetary issues, you need a court of 3 or 1 expert. Throwing out the boy is a capital issue. Throwing you out is a monetary issue. I'm an expert. Ken's gain. I'm an expert. You can go. You can go. And he quit, and he brought the boy back in. And the Chazon Ish himself had to give the shiur for the next few weeks because he didn't have anybody. And he was one of the great sages of the generation, but he needed to give the shiur to these little kids, or whatever age it was. I mean, not so little, I guess, young teenagers. After a few weeks, the Rosh Yeshiva, I guess, saw that the grass is not so much greener on the other side, and he came back. And this boy in the Litvische world became a very well-known, great authority, halachic authority, this boy that the Chazon Ish took back. And his point was, before you call somebody tameh, if you don't really care for that person, if there's no kohen involved, you're not entitled to do that. And if you do that, you become a moitzi shemra. I was recently in Eretz Yisrael, so somebody told me something extraordinary. After the Holocaust, the Panovich Rav, Yosef Shlomo Kahanman, who passed away also in 1969, opened up orphanages in Bnei Brak for children without parents. They were called Batei. He had Batei Avis. He had different homes for senior citizens and for children. And he had an orphanage for girls. And a man once came to him and said that Friday night, the girls have a meal together. They didn't have families, of course. They were orphans. They survived the war, but they didn't have parents. So when girls are sitting together and having a Shabbos meal, at some point they were singing. So this man comes to the Panovich Rav and he says, Friday night, from his window, next door, all these girls are singing. He says, you have to stop them. It's not fair. I'm sitting in my house. I'm not letting hear them. So the Panovich Rav says, what do you want me to do? He says, go tell them they could talk, but they're not let us sing. So the Panovich Rav says, I have to ask the Chazon Ish. This is a serious question. So he goes to the Chazon Ish and he asks him, he says, there's a neighbor of the orphanage of the girls, and he's complaining that they're singing loud Friday night. And he wants to continue asking the question. He wanted to continue, and he wants me to ask them not to sing. As he's telling the Chazon Ish the story, Chazon Ish, I'll say it in Yiddish and then I'll translate. He said, Azoi, ze singen schon? Ze singen schon, nach alt was ze zijn durch singen. Az absurde Teuva, az simche, de meidlich singen. Ze moidedik, ze gewaldig. Meaning, really, after all the girls have been through, they're singing Friday night, they're celebrating their life. That is such unbelievable news. That these girls, when they come together Friday night, they find it within themselves to be able to sing. Now you can understand that the Panovich Rav did not continue the sentence. Now, my hunch is that the Chazon Ish knew exactly what the end of the sentence was. But he wanted to put it in perspective. You have your girls whose parents ended up in the crematoriums in Auschwitz and Treblinka and Dachau. They come together without anybody. Friday night they bond and they sing. So you're going to tell them to stop singing? If you don't want to hear them sing, it's fine. You could go to Egypt for Shabbos. You could find something to put in your ears and stuff your ears. You can go to sleep and take melatonin. You could go somewhere else. Go to the Beis Medrash Friday night and sit and learn for 3 hours. That you're not ready to do. Okay, tell him. I'm not getting into the halachas here. One voice. I know. The TheYeshiva, I know. I'm going to conclude with one final story that I heard from the person himself, and it really gives, I think, it summarizes the perspective. I had a friend, a senior colleague, I should say, whose name was Professor Velvel Green, Zechrona Livracha. He was a rising star in the University of Minnesota. He was a pioneer in the field of bacteriology, meaning he was an expert on bacteria, and he worked for NASA. NASA hired him to figure out something very interesting, to figure out the effects of space travel on human life. And he worked for years in NASA. He was a lecturer in many universities, and his real expertise was in bacteria and various forms of chemistry. He was a very, very well-educated man. Towards the end of his life, he made Aliyah, and he became a professor in Ben Gurion University in Be'er Sheva, where he taught, I believe, till his death a few years ago. In 1963, living in St. Paul, Minnesota, he came across the Chabad ambassador to Minnesota, Rabbi Moshe Feller, and his wife, who just passed away, and they got in contact with him. And he slowly began to discover the world of Yiddishkeit, and he started to come closer to Yiddishkeit. He was a very intellectual man. I knew him quite well. And he had a lot of questions. And he started to learn slowly, and he became very enthralled by the world of Torah. And because he had so many questions, so he would always come to Feller and debate him and discuss him. And one of the big issues was evolution versus creationism. Can we accept that the world was created by God in light of the great and grand theory of evolution that has been so profoundly embraced, supposedly by the academic and scientific world? And Rabbi Feller told him, I'll tell you the truth, I'm not in the league of arguing with a man like you. You're an accomplished scientist, you're an academic. I don't have this background. But what I suggest to you is, why don't you write a letter with all your questions to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who lives in Brooklyn? He's a very, very educated man. And ask him all your questions. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer. So they developed a long correspondence in a lot of areas. Once, Velvel Green writes a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the letter is extremely sharp. What happened? He came across a letter that the Rebbe wrote to another scientist about evolution. The weak points in the theory of evolution and how the academic community is being dishonest about all of the discrepancies and the thousands of intellectual problems with the theory of evolution. It became like a mantra that you're not allowed to question. And he wrote a long letter to the scientist. And Velvel Green, who was a scientist, came across this letter. And he writes to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he says, I read your letter, and usually when I'm writing to a layman, I will try to be respectful. But since I hold you in high prominence, and I respect you, I'm going to write to you bluntly. Lubavitcher Rebbe, why don't you continue doing what you do well? You be a rabbi and leave science to scientists. It's not your field. I see you know nothing of it. And he attacks all of his arguments and objects to them, and from his perspective disproves them. A very sharp letter to the Rebbe saying how he doesn't understand science and doesn't understand evolution and doesn't understand the proofs of evolution and is just trying to defend his religion. And he asked the Rebbe, just stay out of this. This was in 1964. The Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote him back a letter. And instead of addressing the main issue, he wrote, I was delighted to read in your letter that in the summer, you're sending all of your children to a Jewish camp, to Feller Chabad camp in St. Paul. I am so delighted. And he goes on writing a whole letter about the greatness of a Jewish summer camp. And he ignores this whole personal, very, very intense attack on him of how he knows nothing of science and understands nothing. And Green thought, it was the Rebbe's nice way of saying you're right and submitting and acquiescing and just like almost saying, okay, I'll write about summer camps instead Jewish summer camps and Jewish education instead of evolution. So, he felt it would be a little difficult probably for the Rebbe to say, you're right, I'm wrong, I apologize. But this was a nice way of just saying, let's move on and, I won't bring up these topics again and I'll just do my thing and I'll let you do your thing. Fine, which he was fine with that. At least the Rebbe wasn't busy defending himself. And so years went by and he came much closer to Yiddishkeit. He started to put on tefillin and he kashered his home and he started with mikveh. You know how it works. It's not an easy process, especially not in the 60s. Till today, it's not an easy process. Hard for people who grew up in the religious world to understand the transformation that a Baal Tshuva has to go through, especially once they're established with a family and a career and there's parents and there's siblings, etc. It's one of the great, great, courageous moves people could make in life. Some sitting right here in this tent. After years passed, I think it was... After years passed, I think it was 68, quite a few years later, he made the big move, he and his wife, and they took their children out of public school or prep school, and they put them into a Jewish yeshiva, a Jewish day school or a Talmud Torah yeshiva, Jewish institution, which of course is always the key factor of ensuring a future when the children are getting an intense Jewish education on just a half an hour Sunday afternoon coloring a menorah. So Velvel Green wrote a letter to the Rebbe reporting to him that for this September, for the new semester, for the new year, his children are going to a Jewish school. So the Rebbe wrote him back a beautiful letter, acknowledging it and supporting it and mainly blessing him and telling him how happy he was, etc. And then after the letter, postscript, P.S. A few years ago, you wrote me a whole letter about evolution. I didn't answer it at the time, and I would like now to explain to you my position. And he goes on writing to Velvel Green a whole letter, point by point, addressing his attacks on the Rebbe years before about his ignorance in science. And Velvel Green told me that it was an extraordinarily scientifically brilliant letter. Its rationality, its keen arguments, its honesty, its loyalty to the scientific doctrine and principles. He was really, really impressed by it, not emotionally, but academically, pointing out various things very respectfully, but the Rebbe was very succinct and very sharp in terms of the intellectual arguments. He finishes and he says, that's what I wanted to explain to you, what I meant in the first letter that you were so upset about, and I hope it will clear up the issue, and you will see why I maintain this and this perspective. And then he finishes the letter. You may be wondering why I didn't respond to you then when you were starting to come close to Yiddishkeit and you attacked me. Why I didn't feel the need to defend myself and explain my position, especially an important issue. And he says, and the reason for that is because if I would have done it then, I would have won the argument, but I would have lost the Jew. And my mission in life is not to win arguments. My mission in life is to win Jews, to bring them closer to their Father in heaven. He says, my mission in life is to bring Jews closer to Torah and mitzvahs, not ever to win an argument. And that's really the guiding principle that I think the Meshech Chochmah is saying. I can win an argument or not. I can get into an argument. But you don't want to win an argument because you win an argument, but you lost the person. You have to be able sometimes to lose the battle and win the war. There are people who win battles, but always lose the war. They win arguments, but they lose people. Have a wonderful week. Thursday night, 8:30, we will have our Emunah class here. Everybody can ask questions on Emunah at TheYeshiva.net. Next Tuesday, we will have a class. You're welcome, you're welcome, you're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. You're the only one.
No, but actually this was really very much.
You're welcome.